In this episode of Behind the Scenes with Maana Q, we're going to design conditional execution. It's often the case that you have a function graph that you'd like to branch based on some condition being true. For example, let's say you have a function that takes an optional argument. If it's provided, you'd like to use the information. If it isn't, maybe you need to call some service to get the information. We're going to build on previous concepts such as parametric polymorphism and higher order functions. So if you haven't seen those videos, check out the links below. The simplest form of conditional execution is an if-then-else function, which we have depicted here. It accepts a generic input and a generic payload and returns a generic output. It also has a test function, which, given that input, will return a Boolean, true or false. If it's true, then we'll invoke the true function with the payload to return the generic output, and if it's false, we'll invoke the false function with the payload to return the generic output. We can generalize from the single condition if-then-else to multiple conditions through what's known as pattern matching. We have here a function called matchCase that takes the same generic input and the same generic payload to return a generic output. But in this case, we give it multiple test functions with their corresponding true functions if they succeed, and specify a single default function if none of the tests succeed. Let's consider an example using our favorite person kind and the isUnder40 predicate function we developed in the higher order functions video. In this example, we'd like to generate a personalized quote based on the person's age. Now this is just a behind the scenes video as usual, and we imagine that there is an assistive experience for constructing these branching conditions. Here we'd like the assistant to build the conditional execution for us. We'd specify the person kind as the input and the payload type, because that's what our functions expect. The output is a string. We'd use the isUnder40 predicate function as the test, and if it returns true, we'd like to execute quote under 40, and if it's false, we'd like to execute quote over 40. And the assistant would synthesize the generate personalized quote for us as a lambda. So let's take a look at that code now. Let's start by looking at the three functions that are used as part of the example. The first is the predicate function, which simply compares the person's age. The other two are personalized age-appropriate quotes. Next, let's look at the lambda that would be generated by the assistant. As usual, it's divided into two sections. The first is boilerplate that's common for this operation across all instances, and the second is the plan that the assistant specializes for this particular instance. The boilerplate's actually quite simple. We have a helper function for calling those function refs, since we do that in multiple places, and the core match logic will dispatch all of those test functions asynchronously. We'll then look through the results for the first true one we find and invoke its corresponding true function, or if we didn't find one, we'll invoke the default function. And that's about it. The setup for the boilerplate is similar to what we've done previously. Here we need the three function refs for the functions that we're going to call, isUnder40, quote under 40, and quote over 40. We only have one case, which is when the person is under 40, then we want to use the quote under 40, and the default case is to use quote over 40. So we have one case specified, and then in the match plan, the input type is the person, the payload type is the person, we have the set of cases, which is just one, and what to do in the default. This is all the assistant needs to specialize. So let's test it. I've copied and pasted the code into the Lambda assistant for the generate personalized quote function. To test, we'll give it some people, starting with Mary. When we run and look at the function results, we should see Mary's personalized quote. And now we can give it Bob, and we see Bob's personalized quote. Here we have an example of how we can perform conditional execution. In the future, of course, we'll have an assistant to make a nice user experience for all of this. Thank you for watching.